I was never much of a party person, but when my sister invited the whole family to Thanksgiving dinner, I couldn't say no. The weather was mild. The winter still gave signs that I would not arrive so soon, and my sister's house has always been cozy. Everyone was there. My parents, the uncles, the children running down the hall, and that wonderful smell of roast turkey mixed with the spices of the pumpkin pie. It was one of those moments that you try to keep in memory, because you know life will never be so simple after. It was then that, before we sat down at the table, the bell rang. We were not expecting anyone else. My sister looked at me, and my look crossed with hers. A little strangeness hovered in the air. Who else could be coming? She went to the door, and I stood there watching. The wind outside seemed to have intensified, the cold beginning to feel its presence. She opened the door, and there he was. He was a middle-aged man, with a battered overcoat and a hat that partially covered his face. His skin was pale, as if the sun had long since departed from him, and his eyes, I will never forget those eyes, deep, almost as if they had seen too much. He looked at me for a moment so that I felt as if I was being measured. "Good night," he said in a husky voice, as if he hadn't spoken for days. "The weather outside is terrible. Could you give me shelter for a moment?" My sister, always generous, did not hesitate to open the door a little more and nod her head. "Sure, come in. It's Thanksgiving Eve, and there's always room for one more." He thanked quietly and came in, leaving the cold behind, but something else seemed to have come with him, something I could not identify. I watched him for a moment. He had something strange, as if he was always moving, but still standing in the same place. He didn't look real at all, as if he was there, but he wasn't. The stranger smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes, and my stomach made a small knot. The room was full of laughter and lively conversations, but his presence was undeniable. He sat down at the table with a disconcerting ease, as if he had been part of our family for a long time. The children kept looking at him, but he seemed to care, as if he was somewhere else with his mind far away. My mother was the first to speak, trying to lighten the mood. "So, traveler, what brought you here? Are you going somewhere?" He took a while to answer, as if choosing words carefully, and then finally said, "I'm just a storyteller. My journey is just a story to be told. And fate, well, it brought me to you." The environment was quiet for a moment. Everyone at the table exchanged glances, but no one questioned. The stranger was, in his peculiar way, charming. Everyone was intrigued. "Storyteller, huh?" My Uncle George, always skeptical, commented with a smile. "So what kind of stories do you have to tell us?" The stranger looked at him, and his eyes shone in a way that made his heart beat faster. "Oh, many stories. Some cheerful, others not so much. But all are true one way or another." And that's when he started talking. I don't know how long he kept talking. The dinner continued, but something seemed to crumble down deep inside me as he narrated. The story he told about a village forgotten by God, where people never aged but were always on the verge of death, was the first to leave me with a shudder. He had a way of speaking that seemed to manipulate the atmosphere, as if the air around us became denser with every word. And as he spoke, I realized that I was listening, not with my ears but with my whole body. The feeling of discomfort grew. Every story he involved us more. I could not stop looking at him, but at the same time, I wanted to move away. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. And then, in the middle of a story about a man who was being chased by his own nightmares, I heard a strange sound. A low scream, almost as if someone was choking. I looked around trying to locate the source of the sound, but no one seemed to hear. That's when I realized something was missing. My sister. She wasn't on the table anymore. I stood up quickly, but before I could ask, everyone's attention turned to the stranger, who was now smiling in an even more enigmatic way. "Where is your sister?" he asked, as if he knew what I was thinking. But his voice, it wasn't a man's voice. It was something deeper, older. The room was filled with an unusual silence. And it was at that moment that something changed. Something inside the house. Something I couldn't control. I searched my sister in every corner of the house, but she was nowhere. The children were playing in the hallway, oblivious to what was happening, and the adults seemed completely immersed in the conversation of the stranger, as if nothing had happened. But I knew. I felt that something was wrong. When I returned to the table, he was still there, without haste, as if nothing had happened. He looked at me with those deep eyes, the same ones that made me feel an uncomfortable feeling of being watched, even before I realized my sister was missing. "All right?" he asked in a soft voice, but charged with a feeling that seemed to mess with the nerves. I tried to disguise the nervousness, but I couldn't. I went straight to the point. "My sister. Where is she?" She's gone." The stranger looked at me with an empty expression, as if he knew everything. He did not seem surprised or even upset. He didn't say a word. Before I could ask more, my Uncle George, who was at the other end of the table, raised his glass of wine and leaned over to the stranger. "So, since we're all here, how about you tell us more of your stories? Like you promised? We can't wait to hear." I looked at him incredulously. How could he be so calm after what happened? The tension that had grown in me in the last few minutes seemed to be spreading through the environment, but no one seemed to notice it. On the contrary, everyone seemed to be enchanted more and more by the words of the stranger. Without paying attention to me, the stranger settled back in his chair and smiled, a smile that was at least disturbing. "Sure," he said in a tone that made his words seem inevitable. "I can tell many stories. Some are more intense, others are softer, but all have one thing in common. Each of them is a portal, passage to another reality." I frowned. What did he mean by that? But before I could ask, he started talking. He started with a simple story, or at least it seemed to be. He spoke of an old tree in the heart of a forgotten forest. The tree had roots so deep that they were said to touch the very center of the earth. But the strangest thing was that it had no leaves. Instead, his branches were always covered by eyes. Thousands of eyes that watched everything around, from the dawn to the last ray of sunshine. At night, people passing by heard whispers coming from the tree. He continued, his voice soft and rhythmic. Whispers that spoke of secrets that no one should know. And who heard these whispers was never seen again. They say that the tree swallowed them, pulled their souls inward, where they became part of its vast net of eyes, condemned to observe the world forever. I didn't know if I was hearing a legend or if the stranger really believed it, but the air around us seemed to change. The sound of the crackling fireplace subsided, and the heat of the room seemed to disappear. All at the table were quiet, absorbing each word with an obsessive attention. When he finished the story, I looked around the table. The others were immersed in a deep silence, as if history had left something in each of us, something we could not fully understand. But somehow, everyone seemed more distant. I felt like I was hearing that story inside me, as if I was becoming part of it. The stranger did not give any pause for the tension to dissipate. He immediately started another story. This time, he was talking about a man who had lost himself in a strange city, a city that did not appear on the maps, where time seemed to run differently. The city had empty streets, with old and crumbling buildings. The man, lost and without direction, realized that there was something wrong. The people he met seemed to be always watching but never talking. They just followed him. And when the man finally tried to run away, he realized that the streets were like mazes, always leading him back to the same place. He was stuck in a city that didn't exist, where people were no longer human, but something worse. I felt a shiver in the spine. The stranger seemed to be watching us more intensely now, as if his words were directed directly at me. And then something strange happened. One of the children, my niece, who was playing with her toys by the fireplace, suddenly stood up and walked to the middle of the room. She was paralyzed, staring at the void, as if she were watching something that no one else could see. The stranger watched the scene with a slight smile on his face. He did not seem surprised, nor worried. In fact, he seemed to be satisfied, as if he already knew what was happening. Before anyone could react, my niece, with a supernatural calm, whispered, "I saw the tree." I froze. What did she mean by that? How could she know the story the stranger had just told? But when I looked at her, her eyes were empty. She was no longer there. I turned to the others, but no one seemed to notice the change. The stranger kept smiling as if nothing was out of place. And at that moment, I knew whatever was going on in that house was no longer just a story. It was real. And somehow we were all becoming part of it. The room was in complete silence now. None of the adults reacted to what my niece had said. They kept looking at the strange, as if their words had more weight than anything that happened around us. The sound of the fireplace crepitate almost hypnotically, but there was something wrong in the environment. A feeling of cold, as if the air had become denser, more difficult to breathe. I looked at my niece, but she was back in her seat, fiddling with her toys, as if nothing had happened. His eyes were far away, and the expression on his face was empty, as if he was looking at something he could not see. "I saw the tree," she had said, and those words echoed in my mind. But the strangest thing was that nobody seemed to pay attention to it, not even the parents, who were usually so attentive. I took a deep breath, trying to ward off the growing panic, but something told me it wasn't just my imagination. The stranger had spoken of distant worlds, of places where time and reality were bending, and I began to believe that his presence in our house was not a mere coincidence. "Do you still want to tell more stories?" asked my Uncle George, interrupting my thoughts. He seemed enthusiastic, completely oblivious to the discomfort I felt. The stranger smiled, as if he had expected this question. "Sure," he said, the voice loaded with a disturbing calm. "But this story is different." He reclined in the chair and began to speak with a calm that seemed almost artificial, as if he was preparing for something important. It was about a mirror, an old mirror with gold frame and intricate drawings, that was in a house no one else remembered. The mirror reflected not the images of people, but their souls. And, over time, the mirror began to reflect something more, something that no one could understand. As people looked in the mirror, they saw not only their image but a version of themselves at another time, elsewhere. They saw who they could have been, who they were, or what they might become, said the strange, soft voice, but charged with a tension that made my heart beat faster. But the mirror did not only show the future. It also showed what was already lost, what had been forgotten. I felt everyone's eyes on me, but I couldn't look away. Something in the back of my mind was warning me to the danger of the words of the stranger. But my desire to understand, to find out what was happening, was stronger. He was leading us to a place where I did not know if it would be possible to return. And then something happened. My Uncle George, who was sitting at the end of the table, took a long breath and suddenly stood up as if he had been possessed by some invisible force. I saw him walk up to the old mirror that was in the living room, the only one that had been left intact of all the pieces of antique furniture that belonged to my grandparents. He stood before him, his eyes fixed on the glass, and everyone at the table began to look at him in a tense silence. I got up to go to him, but an invisible force stopped me. It was as if my legs were stuck to the ground. Something was holding me, something that could not be explained. I looked around, trying to understand, and then I realized that the stranger was with his eyes closed, almost as if he was in a trance. And when he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. They were deeper, more empty. "Don't worry about him," the stranger said, his voice now lower, almost like a whisper. "He's just watching. All he sees in the mirror is truth. But truth, my dears, is a prison." At that moment, what appeared to be a reflection of my Uncle George in the mirror began to change. I knew something was wrong, but no one else seemed to notice. He was there in the mirror, but not as before. His face was distorted, his features began to writhe, and his body seemed to stretch unnaturally. The reflected image of him looked more like a caricature than a real person. "George, what are you doing?" I cried, but my voice came out muffled, as if being swallowed by the strange atmosphere that took over the house. He did not answer. He didn't even seem to hear. He was just standing there, staring at the mirror as if it were the only thing that mattered at that moment. Then, with a sudden movement, he touched the glass. It was enough for the mirror to start shaking. The sound of the glass cracking filled the room, and I heard a whisper coming from inside the mirror. Something distant, something I could not understand. And then, the next moment, he disappeared. George was just not there anymore. He had disappeared, as if he never existed. The only thing left was the mirror, now empty, reflecting an empty space. I ran to the mirror, trying to understand what had happened, but when I looked inside it, I saw something that made me freeze with terror. It was no longer the reflection of the house. It was no longer the room we were in. It was a dark, dense forest where leafless trees stood like shadows. And in the middle of that forest, there was a face, a familiar face. It was George, but he wasn't the same as before. He was lying there, eyes open, staring at something I couldn't see. I walked away from the mirror, my heart beating out of control. The air seemed denser, and the eyes of everyone in the room were fixed on me, as if they expected me to say something. But I couldn't speak. What had I seen? What happened to the people who looked at that mirror? The stranger looked at me, and this time his smile was no longer enigmatic. He was satisfied, as if he knew what was coming. "Stories, my friend," he said, with a soft and almost comforting tone, "have the power to make you disappear, one piece at a time." The house was in a deadly silence. I looked into the mirror, trying to process what had just happened. George's face in the forest, with empty eyes, was still etched in my mind. He had disappeared from the real world, as if he had never existed, but his reflection, his distorted image in the forest, that was not normal. I tried to look at others, hoping to see some sign of shock, panic, but everyone was in a state of unsettling calm. The stranger, who had once been an enigma, now seemed to be the only person who understood what was happening. He was lying on the chair, his hands entwined over his belly, as if waiting for the next act to begin. I needed to talk. He needs to draw attention to what had just happened. But when I opened my mouth, the words stuck in my throat. The voice was failing me, and the air was heavy, loaded with something I could not understand. It was my niece who broke the silence. "I saw Uncle George," she said, staring into the mirror. His voice was calm, without a trace of fear, as if she already knew what was happening, as if it were a common thing for her. "He's with the tree. He's waiting." That sentence made my heart stop. The tree. It was the same tree of the story that the stranger had told. The tree that grew in alternative worlds, where time did not go as it should, where people were stuck, watching their lives unfold from a distance. And now George was there in the mirror forest waiting. But waiting for what? Before I could ask any question, my wife, Anna, stood abruptly from the table. I looked at her, perplexed. She looked in trance, her eyes empty, as if she was not there. She walked towards the mirror, the slow steps, as if each movement was a struggle. "No," I yelled, but she didn't listen. She just touched the mirror, palm open, and then, in a blink of an eye, she disappeared. I stood still, not knowing what to do. My mind tried to understand what was happening, but every second the answers were more distant. She had touched the mirror just as George had done, and now she was also missing. The stranger did not move. He did not react. He seemed satisfied. He watched everything with a disturbing calm. "Do you see?" he said, the voice soft as the wind. "The stories are doing their job. The mirror is a door, not a window. He takes you inside yourself where you can't go back." I wanted to scream. I wanted to understand, but there was no more time. My legs were shaking. Every second that passed, I felt something pulling us, swallowing us. Everyone was looking at me now, waiting for something, but I had no answers. And then, with a tremor on the wall, the door of the room opened slowly. It was as if some invisible force had decided to drive us out of the room, pushing us into an unknown place. I looked at everyone at the table. They were silent, motionless, but I could see that something was changing in them too. They began to look at each other in a strange way, as if trying to understand what was happening. It was then that my niece, who had been silent before, got up and walked to the mirror. "I'll see the tree too," she said, her voice low and steady as if she knew exactly what she would do. "Uncle George is waiting for me. I have to go too." She touched the mirror with the same softness as Anna and George, and in an instant disappeared. I didn't know what to do. The house was full of a distressing silence, and the feeling that something was closing in on us, trapping us, was almost unbearable. I looked at the stranger, and he stared at me with a patient expression, as if he expected me to understand what was happening. And then a voice came over me, like a whisper on my back, a voice that was not mine, but seemed to come from inside me. "You will also disappear. All will disappear. The mirror, the tree, they are just the beginning." I turned around, but there was no one behind me. The stranger was there, still watching everything, but his presence seemed different now. He was no longer just a storyteller. He was part of what was happening. He was the key. I took a step toward the mirror, but hesitated. I didn't know what I would do. Could I become next? But the feeling of being pulled into that glass, as if something was calling me from within, was too strong. The stranger smiled softly. "You have no choice, my friend. When stories begin to unfold, nobody can stop what is coming." I closed my eyes, tried to resist, but the pressure was overwhelming. When I opened them again, the mirror no longer reflected what was in front of me. There was no room, no house, only darkness, and deep in the darkness a tree stood. I didn't know how long it had been since the darkness swallowed me up. There were no clocks. There was no sound, just a feeling of absolute emptiness. The feeling of being observed, of being pulled to some distant place, dominated me. I didn't know what had happened to my family, to the house, but I knew something terrible was happening, and that I was at the center of it. The tree was there, in front of me, imposing and lonely. It seemed alive, breathing, pulsating with a strange energy. Its roots extended to the ground, but there was no land there. The ground was a dark, smooth surface like glass, and the tree seemed to float without a solid base, as if it were stuck between worlds, between realities. I reached out to touch her, but something stopped me. The presence of the tree was so strong that my body hesitated, as if it were forced to stay away. And then, on the horizon of darkness, something moved. A silhouette. It was George, or what remained of him. He was with his back to me, as if he did not recognize me, but his presence was unmistakable. He was there, in the mist that enveloped the tree, immersed in a disturbing stillness. There was no expression on his face, but his eyes, when they turned to me, were empty, as if he was in another place, in another time. "George?" My voice sounded weak and distorted, as if it were muffled by a layer of ice. He did not answer. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point, somewhere beyond me, beyond the tree. I took a step towards him, but as I did so, the ground under my feet moved. The darkness seemed to swallow every step I took, every move I tried to make. It was as if the space around me was being reconfigured, as if the walls of reality were bending. The tree seemed to pulse stronger now, its branches stretching out towards me, and suddenly the stranger appeared before me, without warning, without sound. He was there, as if he had always been, as if he were part of the very darkness. "Don't come any closer," he said, his voice calm as if it were a warning. "You're too close. The tree has chosen who will continue and who will disappear. And you, my friend, have made your choice. What do you want from me?" My voice was hoarse, desperate. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. The stranger smiled, a smile that seemed to have no end. "I am just the storyteller. I have no power over choices. The mirror, the tree, what you are experiencing now. All this is a story that unfolds, and each of you is being pulled into it." He stepped back, and the darkness around him seemed to expand, swallowing everything around him. "But you, my friend, still have a choice. The tree is waiting. It's the last door. You can move on and become part of the story, or you can try to escape. But remember, no story ends without an ending, and you can't escape it." I looked back at the tree. Its branches were now intertwined, forming a huge arch that seemed to swallow everything around it. It was as if she was calling me, as if she knew I was close to making my decision. I took a deep breath and took another step. I didn't know what I would find, but I couldn't go back. Whatever was happening, I needed to face it. So without any further hesitation, I went through the tree arch. The moment I touched the branches, everything around me disappeared. The feeling of being dragged was unbearable. Whatever was pulling me was not physical, but a crushing pressure, which made me lose the notion of time, space. I didn't know if I was walking, falling, or being carried by some invisible current. Everything around me was in a whirlwind, a mixture of darkness, shadows, and flashes of images that made no sense. The tree disappeared. The stranger disappeared. Only the emptiness remained, until, without further warning, the pressure disappeared. I fell to my knees, as if the ground had simply returned to its place, and the darkness was replaced by a dim and faint light, which I did not know whether it came from some specific place or was just the reflection of something that was about to happen. When I looked up, I saw myself back in the dining room as if nothing had happened. The table was still set, the dinner was still there, the chairs were intact, and everything seemed to be in perfect order, as if none of the disturbing events had occurred. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel, at my fingertips, a tension in the air, a strange energy that should not be there. I looked around, and then I saw. They were there, all the members of my family, but they weren't the same. George was standing by the door, staring into the void. Anna, my wife, was sitting at the table, but her eyes were lost, as if looking at a place that no longer existed. And my niece was there too, but she didn't smile. There was no expression on his face, and his skin was pale, almost translucent, as if life had been drained from it. And the stranger? He was there, sitting at the head of the table with a smile of satisfaction. He was no longer as enigmatic as before. Now he looked like a master of ceremonies, watching the final piece of a story he had orchestrated. "You made your choice, my friend," he said, his voice soft but loaded with a disturbing intensity. "Every story has an ending, and each character has a role. You've entered the story, and now you're part of it, forever." His words cut the air like a blade. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run away. But something inside me knew there was no way out. I had crossed the line. I had become part of this narrative that had no end, a character who could not return. The light around me began to fade, and darkness again took over the room. But this time, it was not the darkness of the unknown. It was a comfortable, familiar darkness that enveloped me like a tight embrace. I looked at my family again. They were moving away from me, as if being dragged to another place. George moved away to the door, disappearing into the mist that was rising beneath it. Anna stood up, walking towards the window, her steps smooth and unhurried. And my niece. She approached me, her expression now empty, as if knowing that I could do nothing to change what was happening. And then she whispered, so low that I could hardly hear, "We never left here. None of us." The last word was like an echo, repeated by all other members of my family, who were now completely absent, their presences absorbed in the darkness. The stranger smiled one last time, and his figure faded into the mist, as if it were only a part of the scene, a shadow at the end of an endless story. I tried to fight it, I tried to scream. I tried to wake up, but it was useless. I didn't know if I was alive or dead, if what was happening was real or just the last breath of a broken mind. All I knew was that I was stuck there, in that room with those faces that were once mine, but now were only shadows of what they used to be. And the mirror was there reflecting everything. The tree, the fog, the missing faces, and the house, which now looked like a prison. Everything was inside him, as if it were a portal to another world, a world where time and space meant nothing. I looked in the mirror one last time. The stranger was no longer there, only the reflection of the tree with its twisted branches, stretching out as if it waited for me, for all of us. And then the mirror broke. My name is David, and the idea of spending the holiday on the farm was mine. Maybe that already says everything you need to know about how things went wrong. The farm belonged to a family of my colleague, Ryan. He used to talk about it as a secluded paradise away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It seemed perfect for a group getaway. We were 6 in all: me, Ryan, Emily, Sarah, Josh, and Tyler. Friends since college, with that unique chemistry that comes from years of living together, internal jokes, antics, and a feeling that nothing could affect us. We arrived in the late afternoon, after hours driving. The sun was starting to set when Ryan's car turned on the dirt road that led to the farm. The place looked like out of a painting. Golden fields, a red barn worn in the distance, and a large and simple wooden house marked by time. It was not exactly welcoming, but had a rustic charm, as something forgotten by the modern world. That's when I felt it. Something in the air seemed different, a kind of weight that I could not ignore, as if the place had its own life and was watching us. I tried to push away the feeling, probably just tired from the trip, I thought. "Welcome to paradise," Ryan announced, opening his arms as we stepped out of the car. We explore the house first. Inside, it was all very rustic. Dark wooden furniture, old paintings on the walls, and that unmistakable smell of things kept for too long. Ryan turned on the lights, which blinked a few times before stabilizing. "No one has been here for years," he explained with a nervous smile. Outside in the yard was a huge tree. Its roots spread like claws, sinking deep into the earth, and its leaves whispered softly, even without wind. "Is that a tree or a monster?" Tyler joked. I laughed, but the joke made me uneasy. As the sun went down, the farm seemed to change. The shadows were longer, denser, and the silence around us was almost deafening. Emily was the first to notice something strange. As we unloaded the car, she stopped abruptly, looking out into the field in the distance. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Josh asked, balancing a cooler in his arms. "A laugh. Out in the field." Everyone stopped for a moment, in silence, but all we could hear was the sound of crickets and wind. "I think you're imagining things, Emily," Sarah said, trying to lighten the mood with a smile. But I noticed that Emily was uncomfortable. She didn't respond. Later, when we finally settled in the house, Ryan suggested that we explore the barn. He said there was something historical that he wanted to show us. When we opened the creaking doors, a wave of dust enveloped us. Inside, there were tools hanging on the walls: sickles, shovels, and something that looked like an improvised old guillotine covered in rust and cobwebs. "My great-grandfather used these things in the crops," Ryan casually explained. "The land here is famous for fertility. Fertility or sacrifice," Tyler teased, pointing at the rusty blade. Everyone laughed, but that night, while I was sitting on the hard mattress of one of the rooms, I could not stop thinking about the way the light of the lantern reflected on that blade. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that there was someone standing next to my bed, watching me. I looked around, but all I saw were shadows. And that was just the beginning. The next day, we woke up early with the sun rays invading the rooms. The house looked more welcoming in daylight, and the weight in the air I felt on arrival had diminished. Ryan was excited to show us around. After a makeshift coffee bread, instant coffee, and rancid butter, we went out to explore the farm. Outside, he led us to an old well, hidden by weeds and almost covered with rotten planks. My grandfather used to say that this well has a dark history, Ryan commented, while kicking a stone inside. Dark how? Sarah asked, curious, while holding her hair back because of the wind. Ryan shrugged his shoulders. They say the well never dries, no matter how hot the summer is. Some people believe that it feeds on the souls of those who have disappeared here. Disappeared? Tyler laughed, incredulous. Are you serious? Totally serious. The people of the city swore that during the harvest some people disappeared without a trace. Ryan seemed to enjoy the group's unbelief. My grandfather thought they were just stories to scare the kids. The conversation was interrupted when Emily pointed out something strange in the field. She saw what looked like a cross made of dry branches, stuck in the middle of the high pasture. When we approached, we saw that it was tied with a kind of braided rope, almost black from so old. What a bizarre thing, Josh whispered, touching the wood. It must be some old scarecrow, Ryan said, but there was something in his voice that sounded uncertain. The day passed quickly as we explored the surroundings. We found an old rusted tractor, a locked shed, and a path leading to a small forest. Everything on the farm seemed full of history, as if each object had witnessed something that he would rather not tell. When we came back home at dusk, the weather was heavier. Emily was restless since we found the cross in the field. During dinner, she finally said, "Did you notice that all these stories that Ryan told happen at the same time? Always during the harvest." "So what?" Sarah asked while she was chewing on a sandwich. "And so we are here at exactly this time," Emily replied, looking around the table. An uncomfortable silence fell on the group. Ryan tried to disguise it with a laugh. "Oh, come on. That's just a coincidence." People at that time were superstitious. They liked to invent these stories, but no one seemed convinced. Later that night, as we were packing up the living room for a movie, the front door slammed hard. Everyone froze. Ryan was the first to get up, picking up a flashlight. "It must have been the wind," he muttered, opening the door. But when he looked out, the wind was completely stopped. We went back inside, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. However, something seemed wrong. The house was much quieter than before, as if the environment itself were watching us. Couldn't sleep that night. When I finally closed my eyes, I was woken by a distant sound, something between a whimper and a whisper. I got up from the bed and went to the window. Looking out into the field, I saw the cross we had found before, now with something attached to it. It was hard to say what it was, but it looked like flesh. My heart popped. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust the vision. But when I looked again, it was empty. And at that moment I was sure we were not alone. I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. For a second, I thought some of us had gotten up early, but when I looked at the clock, I saw that it was still dawn. 3h42. Stood up slowly, trying not to make a noise. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked to the door of the room. When I opened it, the corridor was empty. The sound of footsteps had disappeared, but an uncomfortable feeling remained with me. That feeling that something was wrong, but you don't know exactly what. When I got to the kitchen, I found Emily sitting at the table. She looked agitated, her eyes fixed on a cup of cold coffee. "Did you hear?" she asked without taking her eyes from the cup. The steps? She nodded slowly. It was none of us. Before I could answer, the back door slammed hard. Emily and I looked at each other with wide eyes. I took a flashlight that was on the counter and opened the door carefully. On the outside, everything was quiet, but there were marks on the ground, footprints that led towards the field. Someone was here, I murmured. We need to wake up the others. In a few minutes, everyone was gathered in the kitchen. Ryan, who was visibly angry, grumbled about collective paranoia, but even he kept quiet when he saw the footprints in the yard. Maybe it was an animal, he suggested, trying to sound confident. Since when do animals leave human footprints? Recounted Tyler, crossing his arms. Josh suggested that we follow the marks, despite Sarah's protests. I didn't want to go, but something told me we couldn't ignore it. We took lanterns and followed the trail that disappeared between the high fields. The walk seemed endless. The light of the lanterns flickered as we went, and the silence around us was almost oppressive. Eventually, the footprints led us to a clearing in the middle of the field. There we found something that made us stop instantly. In the center of the clearing, there was a perfect circle of dark earth, almost black, as if it had been burned. Inside it, a collection of disturbing objects. Bones, melted candles, and what seemed to be clothes worn by time. In the center, a large cross of dry branches, similar to that we found the previous day. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It seems a ritual," Emily said, taking a step back. "That's bullshit. Someone must have set this up to scare us," Ryan insisted, but his voice didn't have the same conviction as before. While we were looking at the place, I noticed something strange. The air there was colder, as if we were in another place, separated from the rest of the farm. The wind began to blow, bringing with it a smell of wet earth mixed with something metallic. Blood. Josh, who had approached the cross, stumbled upon something buried in the earth. He knelt to dig up the object and, holding it in his hand, his expression changed into pure terror. "It's a tooth," he said, dropping the object on the ground. Suddenly the wind increased, carrying the candles out of the field and making the leaves of the trees whisper in unison. It wasn't long before we heard the sound again, that distant, deep lament that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I think we should go back," Emily suggested, looking around, eyes wide. We did not discuss. We turned off the flashlights and ran back to the house, with the feeling that something was watching us as we left. When we finally locked the door behind us, no one said a word. We stood in silence, listening to our own hearts beating fast. But deep down, we all knew we had not seen everything. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard again the sound of footsteps in the corridor. This time they were heavier. Slowly they stopped, right in front of my door. I woke up with a shock. The steps had stopped at my bedroom door, but no one came in. I was motionless in bed, holding my breath as I listened to the silence of the corridor. It was then that something else caught my attention. A deep, rhythmic sound, which seemed to come from the outside. A drum. I stood up slowly and looked out the window. Outside, the field was covered by a dense fog, but in the middle of the darkness I could see a faint light flashing. A flame. I didn't want to go alone, so I woke up Ryan, who was sleeping in the next room. He muttered something incomprehensible before finally understanding what I was saying. His face was pale as he looked out the window beside me. "That wasn't there before," he whispered. We woke the others. Sarah and Emily were terrified, but Josh and Tyler insisted that we needed to investigate. "We can't just ignore it. What if it's someone playing with us?" Tyler argued, picking up the flashlight. "Or worse," Emily hit back, hesitant. Despite the arguments, we went out together. The night seemed colder, and the fog made everything around us indistinct, almost surreal. We headed for the light, which seemed to be pulsating as if it were alive. The sound of the drum became louder, vibrating in our bones. As we approached, we saw a fire burning in the center of the clearing where we had found the circle of black earth. But now the place was different. Surrounding the fire, there were dozens of crosses similar to those we found before, all carved into the ground irregularly. And in the center, something moved. A black cloak seemed to writhe over the fire, as if it were alive. As we got closer, we realized that it was not just fabric. It was meat. Meat twisted and blackened, as if it is forming and dissolving at the same time. "What is it?" Josh asked, unable to look away. Before anyone could answer, the ground under our feet began to vibrate slightly. The drum stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from under the earth. "We need to get out of here," Emily begged, grabbing my arm. But before we could move, the ground inside the circle opened up, as if the earth was being devoured from the inside out. Suddenly something emerged, a hand, skeletonized and covered with roots and mud, stretched out from the ground. I screamed, but the sound was muffled by the group's collective cry. More hands began to come out, grasping the air and pulling themselves out. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, all fighting to escape. Ryan was the first to move. He ran towards the house, shouting for us to follow him. But as we run, the earth under our feet seemed to come alive. It was as if something tried to pull us down, roots curling up in our ankles, making each step difficult. We arrived at the house panicked and terrified, locking the door behind us. Tyler fell to the ground, trying to get rid of a root that was still attached to his shoe. Josh, who was usually the most skeptical, was in shock, quietly repeating, "This is not real. This is not real." From outside, the sound returned. The drum was louder, faster, and now it was accompanied by voices, not human but distorted, as if echoing from another world. Ryan looked at us, pale face. "The earth, it's alive, and it's hungry." At that moment, the lights of the house flickered and went out. The darkness enveloped us, and from outside, the sound seemed closer and closer. Something was coming. The dark seemed to swallow everything. Our lanterns barely lit the interior of the house, and the sound of the drum continued to vibrate around us, now accompanied by something even more disturbing. Whispers. They came from all sides, meaningless words, repeated as a macabre song. "We need to get out of here," Sarah cried, the voice trembling. Ryan went to the window and peered through the window. When he walked away, he seemed to have seen his own death. "They are here." "Who?" I asked, although part of me already knew the answer. "The things in the field." We all stood still for a moment, caught between the desire to believe that was an illusion and the certainty that something real was out there. Tyler took a knife from the kitchen, as if that could make any difference, while Emily grabbed a small crucifix she wore around her neck. It was Josh who made the boldest and craziest decision. "We can't stay here. Let's go to the car and get out of this damn place." "What if we can't?" Emily asked. Josh didn't answer. Instead, he ran to the door and opened it, letting in a cold blast of air and the sound of voices now louder. Outside, the field looked different. The fog was thicker, but we could see silhouettes moving through the bushes. They were not human. Their bodies were elongated and slender, with disproportionately long arms that scraped the ground as they approached. "Run!" shouted Josh, shooting in the direction of the car. We followed him, our feet sinking into the wet earth, which seemed to want to hold us. The creatures began to emerge from the mist, moving erratically, as if they were being controlled by some invisible force. We got to the car, but when Josh tried to open the door, it was locked. He reached for the keys in his pockets, but was interrupted by a deafening sound. A cry, not human, but so loud and visceral that we felt it in our bones. Something greater emerged from the field. It was not a creature, but the earth itself. She rose like a wave, opening to reveal a dark abyss from which hands and deformed faces emerged, all screaming in unison. "The keys! Quick!" Ryan howled, shaking Josh. Josh finally found the keys and unlocked the car. We stumbled in and he started. The engine roared, but before we could accelerate, something huge hit the vehicle, making it swing. I looked out the window and saw a face. Not a human face, but something made of earth and roots, with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to devour the light around it. "Go, go, go!" I cried. The car shot off the road, while the creatures chased. The fog seemed to close around us, and the drum, which was now further away, began to slow down, as if he knew we had escaped by a narrow margin. After what seemed like an eternity, the farm was left behind, and silence took hold again. No one said a word. We were all in shock, trying to understand what had happened. It was only when we were miles away that Sarah broke the silence. What was that thing? No one answered. There were no words to describe. When we finally arrived in town, we parked the car at a gas station. Emily looked at us with tears in her eyes. Is this over? I didn't know what to say. I looked at my friends, all worn out, terrified but alive. Wanted to believe that it was over, that we had escaped. But when I looked at my hands, I realized that they were dirty with dirt, and I could not clean them. It was then that I understood. The earth marked us, and maybe it was still waiting for us.